The majestic sterile lobby of the United Nations in New York City radiated an aura of absolute and untouchable global power, decorated with vibrant international flags and impeccably polished marble floors. Inside, world leaders in expensive designer suits debated the future of humanity in sophisticated languages, completely insulated within their impenetrable bubble of diplomatic influence. Immediately outside those fortified security gates, the harsh and cutting reality of a freezing Manhattan plaza revealed a completely different and cruel world. Invisible immigrants fought a daily, grueling battle against the biting wind and urban indifference, trying desperately to survive another day of hard labor without drawing the slightest attention from rigorous authorities. The brutal contrast between opulent bureaucratic safety and the raw vulnerability of the streets formed an invisible but painfully real divide, separating those who decided world destinies from those who merely suffered the severe consequences. Ambassador Aminata Fall, a majestic black woman with a sharp yet deeply exhausted gaze, walked through this unforgiving plaza during a brief pause from the tense General Assembly. Wearing elegant civilian clothes, but missing her usual golden diplomatic immunity pin, she simply desired a warm coffee to ward off the accumulated fatigue of empty speeches about human rights. Suddenly, the shrill sound of desperate screams cut through the deafening noise of New York traffic, drawing her attention to a dark corner of the sidewalk. Are you already feeling the palpable tension of this deeply emotional and realistic story? I invite you to subscribe to our channel right now and comment below from which city in the world you are watching as we continue our journey. Aminata turned her face and witnessed a heartbreaking scene that would violently shake the very foundation of all her established certainties. An aggressive and brutal American immigration raid was happening right there, just a few meters away from the global epicenter of world diplomacy. A visibly altered and hostile federal agent shouted racist insults at a fragile elderly flower vendor, who cried profusely without understanding a single word of English. Beside her, little Kofi, a 7-year-old immigrant boy, tried uselessly to protect his terrified grandmother by using his own frail body as a makeshift human shield. The young boy tightly clutched a small, frayed bilingual dictionary against his panting chest, as if that worn-out little book were a magical amulet capable of saving them from this horrific public humiliation. The uniformed agent cruelly mocked the trembling, broken English of the desperate child, violently pushing the delicate flowers and scattering crushed petals across the filthy, wet asphalt of that merciless and incredibly cold North American metropolis. Driven by a long-dormant instinct for survival and pure empathy, Aminata peacefully approached the terrifying commotion, raising her hands in an international gesture of total appeasement. With her calm, polished, and perfectly articulated voice, she attempted to translate the elderly woman's words and de-escalate the absurd tension of that critical moment. However, completely blinded by a deeply rooted structural prejudice, the aggressive federal agent looked at the color of Aminata's skin and immediately assumed the worst possible scenario in his limited mind. He summarily ignored the tremendous eloquence of her impeccable speech and her firm warnings that she was a high-ranking official working at the United Nations. To that man, filled with inexplicable hatred, she was nothing more than another meddlesome undocumented immigrant, desperately trying to defend her own criminal compatriots in a totally subversive and highly illegal manner, right on the public street. "Shut your mouth right now, lady, or I will arrest you too for blatant obstruction of federal justice," the agent snarled with a disproportionate and frightening fury. Aminata took a firm step forward, taking a deep breath to maintain the diplomatic composure she had spent years of her life exhaustively perfecting in extremely complex international negotiations. Before she could even finish spelling out her high-ranking title or demand to make a simple security call to the General Secretariat, the officer brutally lunged at her body. With aggressive and humiliating movements that drew frightened stares from the rare pedestrians around, he violently confiscated the expensive leather bag containing her valuable international identification documents. The sudden shock caused by the unprovoked physical assault paralyzed the brilliant diplomat for a brief and terrifying instant, completely knocking all the air out of her lungs immediately. The freezing cold of the heavy metal handcuffs tightening around her wrists was a brutal physical shock, but the true impact that devastated her soul was entirely emotional and psychological. Thrown unceremoniously into the incredibly dark back of a locked immigration van right next to little Kofi, who was crying copiously, and his grandmother in a state of complete shock, Aminata felt an old, deep wound bleed again. Without her gleaming gold pin, she was absolutely no one special in the eyes of that racist system. Her skin color had transformed her into an immediate and disposable target. The permanent illusion of safety she had meticulously built over decades at the United Nations crumbled in mere terrifying seconds. The raw, suffocating panic of her traumatic childhood as a frightened refugee girl instantly invaded her veins in a completely uncontrollable and overwhelmingly painful manner. The cold, metallic walls of the temporary immigration holding cell felt suffocatingly familiar, transporting Aminata back to a terrifying past she had spent decades trying to forget. Long before the tailored designer suits and the impeccable polyglot speeches in the polished halls of the United Nations, she was just a frightened, shivering refugee child fleeing a bloody war. The scent of damp concrete and unwashed bodies in the cramped windowless room triggered suppressed memories of overcrowded refugee camps where survival was a daily, brutal lottery. She had aggressively clawed her way to the absolute pinnacle of global diplomacy, building an impenetrable fortress of bureaucratic power and intellectual superiority around her deeply scarred heart. Yet, sitting on that filthy bench, she realized that her glittering armor was entirely useless without the institutional gold pin that validated her human worth to them. For years, Aminata had existed in a sterile golden cage of her own making, residing in a breathtaking Manhattan penthouse that touched the clouds, but remained entirely devoid of human warmth. She spent her days delivering passionate, meticulously crafted speeches about fundamental human rights to powerful presidents and prime ministers, receiving polite applause in return. However, her nights were consumed by an agonizing, silent loneliness, completely disconnected from the visceral, bleeding pain of the marginalized people she theoretically swore to protect. The towering stacks of international treaties and legally binding resolutions felt like a cruel, elaborate joke in the face of this raw, unfiltered degradation. She had traded her profound empathy for sterile efficiency, becoming a masterful architect of global policies while systematically numbing the agonizing, unresolved grief of her own shattered childhood, deeply buried under mountains of paperwork. The harsh, flickering fluorescent light overhead cast long, distorted shadows across the miserable faces of the dozens of undocumented immigrants crammed into the freezing, unsanitary holding pen. The air was incredibly thick with the suffocating stench of fear, stale sweat, and silent despair, a stark contrast to the fragrant, climate-controlled environments Aminata was accustomed to breathing. Guards patrolled the heavy iron doors with a casual, terrifying brutality, their heavy boots echoing ominously against the stained concrete floor, a constant reminder of their absolute, unquestionable authority over these fragile lives. Women wept softly into their thin, inadequate jackets, while exhausted men stared blankly at the peeling paint on the walls, silently calculating the catastrophic ruin of their American dreams. In this forgotten, windowless purgatory, human dignity was systematically stripped away, replaced by the terrifying, paralyzing uncertainty of imminent deportation and profound, inescapable loss. Huddled in the darkest, coldest corner of the overcrowded cell, Kofi's elderly grandmother rocked back and forth in a state of inconsolable, silent hysteria, her frail body trembling violently. She clutched a torn, muddy plastic bag containing the crushed, unsold flowers from the plaza, the vibrant petals now bruised and ruined, mirroring her own shattered spirit. Without the ability to speak or understand a single word of English, the aggressive shouts of the federal agents sounded like the terrifying roar of predatory beasts. Her wrinkled, calloused hands that had worked tirelessly in foreign soil to feed her family, now shook uncontrollably as tears carved deep, painful paths down her weathered cheeks. The profound injustice of her situation radiated through the freezing room. A woman who only sought honest, backbreaking labor now treated as a dangerous, unforgivable threat to national security. Beside the trembling old woman, little Kofi desperately tried to project a courageous facade that was heartbreakingly inadequate for his tender, fragile 7 years of age. He wrapped his remarkably thin, shivering arms around his grandmother's shaking shoulders, whispering soft, melodic reassurances in their native tongue, though his own voice trembled with poorly concealed terror. Despite wearing clean, carefully mended clothes that clearly showed the immense pride and love of his struggling family, the harsh weather and unforgiving streets had left a permanent layer of exhaustion in his large, expressive eyes. He was just a small, innocent child, yet the cruel circumstances of their undocumented immigrant life had mercilessly forced him to carry the crushing, unbearable weight of an entire adult world on his incredibly tiny, developing shoulders, robbing him of the simple, carefree joy of a normal, protected childhood. Kofi's small, dirt-streaked fingers tightly gripped his most precious earthly possession, a frayed, heavily taped bilingual dictionary with curled pages and a faded, practically unrecognizable cover. He clutched the tiny book against his rapidly beating chest with an almost religious fervor, treating it not just as a learning tool, but as a magical, protective talisman against the hostile world. On the freezing streets of New York, he genuinely believed that if he could just learn enough kind, polite English words, he could somehow shield his beloved grandmother from the cruel harassment of authorities. He meticulously memorized phrases of gratitude to charm reluctant customers, viewing language as his only viable weapon and fragile armor in a society that constantly threatened to erase their very existence and tear their loving family apart without a single shred of remorse or human compassion. From her spot on the cold metal bench, Aminata watched the young boy's desperate, heroic attempts to comfort his grandmother, feeling a sharp, agonizing pain pierce her carefully guarded heart. The sight of Kofi clutching that battered dictionary instantly shattered the thick, emotional walls she had painstakingly built over decades of sterile diplomatic maneuvering and high society isolation. She saw a haunting, unmistakable reflection of her own terrified, vulnerable childhood self in the boy's wide, desperate eyes, remembering the exact, paralyzing fear of being a helpless outsider in a completely unforgiving land. The exquisite, incredibly expensive fabric of her tailored designer suit suddenly felt like a repulsive, suffocating costume, an offensive symbol of her hypocritical detachment from the very real bleeding humanity she hypocritically claimed to champion in those majestic, heavily guarded international assembly halls that now seemed entirely meaningless. Slowly, deliberately ignoring the ingrained protocols of her high society status and the thick layer of grime covering the unsanitary concrete floor, the brilliant ambassador slid off the metal bench. She sat directly on the freezing, filthy ground right next to the terrified, huddled immigrant family, ruining her $1,000 silk trousers without a single second of hesitation or regret. The profound, shocking contrast between her impeccable, elegant appearance and the miserable, degraded environment immediately drew a hesitant, wide-eyed look from the traumatized little boy. Aminata did not offer empty, bureaucratic promises or recite complex legal statutes about human rights. Instead, she simply offered her profound, silent presence, bridging the massive, seemingly insurmountable gap between her world of global power and their world of absolute vulnerability. For the very first time in decades, she allowed herself to truly, deeply feel the raw pain. "Are you okay, little one?" Aminata whispered in an incredibly soft, gentle tone, purposely keeping her voice low to avoid attracting the cruel attention of the pacing guards outside. Kofi flinched slightly, his dark eyes darting nervously toward the heavy iron door, before slowly returning to the elegant, mysterious woman sitting in the dirt beside him. He hesitated for a long, agonizing moment, his small hands gripping the frayed dictionary even tighter, desperately searching her exhausted but profoundly empathetic face for any sign of deception or danger. "They took our flowers," the boy finally murmured, his voice cracking with a heartbreaking mixture of profound sadness and innocent confusion that tore at Aminata's soul. "My grandma didn't do anything wrong. We were just trying to buy food for tonight, and then the bad men came and yelled at us." "I know, sweetheart. I know they did," Aminata replied, her voice trembling slightly with a deeply buried emotion she had not allowed herself to express since she was a refugee. She slowly reached out, her manicured fingers gently brushing a speck of dirt from the boy's tear-stained cheek, the simple, tender gesture carrying more genuine weight than any resolution she had ever drafted. "Sometimes, the people who are supposed to protect us are blinded by their own fear and ignorance. But that does not mean you or your wonderful grandmother did anything wrong." Kofi looked down at his battered shoes, a heavy, devastating sigh escaping his tiny lips as he leaned slightly closer to the surprising warmth radiating from the stranger. The profound injustice of a system that criminalized pure survival burned fiercely inside Aminata, igniting a dormant, powerful fury. With trembling hands, Kofi slowly opened his precious, heavily taped dictionary, the fragile, yellowed pages completely filled with crude, handwritten phonetic pronunciations of essential English survival phrases. "I tried to tell the angry man that we were sorry, that we would leave the plaza," the boy whispered, a massive, unbidden tear finally escaping his eye and splashing onto the worn paper. "I learned the words perfectly. I practiced them every single night so he would understand that we are good people, but he didn't even want to listen to me speak." Aminata stared at the desperately underlined words, "please" and "thank you," feeling a crushing, unbearable wave of immense guilt wash over her entire being. This child believed in the magical, unifying power of language far more than she did. Yet the cruel, racist reality of the world had violently betrayed him. The agonizing realization that she had spent her entire distinguished diplomatic career hiding behind beautiful, complex words in sterile marble halls struck Aminata with the devastating force of a physical blow. She had meticulously negotiated international treaties using 5 different, perfectly accented languages, yet none of her brilliant, globally broadcasted eloquence had managed to shield this innocent, terrified boy from brutal, systemic prejudice. She had become incredibly rich in bureaucratic power and societal influence, but she was entirely, shamefully bankrupt in the raw, essential human action required to actually protect the vulnerable people shivering in the dark. The thick, comfortable walls of her luxurious penthouse had successfully blocked out the harsh, desperate cries of the streets, allowing her to comfortably ignore the daily, agonizing suffering of immigrants, just like the frightened family she herself once belonged to many years ago. The grandmother let out another soft, piercing wail of profound despair, her body rocking violently as the traumatizing shock of the sudden, brutal arrest continued to ravage her fragile nervous system. Acting purely on a deep, primal instinct buried deep within her DNA, Aminata closed her eyes, took a deep, steadying breath, and began to hum a very ancient, deeply soothing melody. It was a beautiful, melancholic lullaby in her native West African dialect, the exact same comforting song her own terrified mother had sung to her in the pitch-black cargo hold of a smuggler's ship. The rich, velvety timbre of her resonant voice effortlessly cut through the thick, suffocating despair of the holding cell, carrying an immense ancestral power that transcended the urgent need for direct, literal translation. The chaotic, frightening noises of the detention center seemed to magically fade away, as the incredibly beautiful, rhythmic cadence of the traditional song filled the freezing, unsanitary room. A miraculous, almost instantaneous transformation slowly began to wash over the deeply traumatized immigrant family. The grandmother's violent, uncontrollable shivering gradually subsided, her tear-filled eyes widening in profound astonishment as she recognized the familiar, comforting ancestral tones that spoke directly to her shattered, bleeding soul. Little Kofi, completely exhausted by the sheer, unimaginable terror of the afternoon's brutal events, tentatively rested his heavy, aching head against Aminata's incredibly expensive, now completely ruined silk-clad shoulder. The brilliant, untouchable ambassador gently wrapped her arms around the incredibly fragile child, holding him tightly against her racing heart, finally allowing her own long-suppressed, agonizing tears to freely fall into the darkness. In that profoundly vulnerable moment, the rigid, unfeeling diplomat completely died, and the fierce protector awakened. Holding the sleeping boy in the filthy holding cell, Aminata made a silent, unbreakable vow that would permanently alter the entire trajectory of her comfortable, highly privileged existence. She realized with absolute, crystal-clear certainty that impassioned speeches delivered to politely clapping billionaires and out-of-touch politicians would absolutely never save the fragile lives of people like Kofi and his grandmother. She deliberately decided that she would no longer be a mere passive, elegant voice for the voiceless in sanitized, international rooms. She would become their impenetrable, ferocious shield right here on the brutal streets. She would unleash the absolute, terrifying fury of international law, utilizing every single ounce of her immense, untouched diplomatic immunity, not just to punish this profoundly corrupt system, but to absolutely decimate the arrogant career of the racist agent who had terrorized this innocent family. Meanwhile, outside the heavy iron doors of the holding cell, the arrogant, deeply prejudiced ICE agent who had violently arrested them was rapidly processing the aggressive deportation paperwork with malicious glee. Completely oblivious to the catastrophic career-ending mistake he had just committed, he laughed loudly with his colleagues, cruelly mocking the delusional black woman who dared to claim she worked for the UN. He vindictively denied her fundamental legal right to make a simple telephone call, actively rushing the bureaucratic process to ensure the vulnerable family would be forcefully removed from the country before dawn. He felt incredibly powerful, an untouchable enforcer of the law, violently exerting his absolute dominance over people he considered completely insignificant, entirely unaware that he had just locked away a diplomatic force of nature capable of destroying his entire professional life with a single phone call. Simultaneously, a frantic, escalating panic was rapidly sweeping through the highly secure, heavily guarded upper echelons of the United Nations headquarters, completely disrupting the orderly flow of the ongoing General Assembly. Ambassador Aminata Fall, one of the most vital, fiercely respected, and strategically important diplomats on the entire global stage, had completely vanished without a single logical trace during a crucial session. Her elite security detail was frantically scouring the chaotic Manhattan streets, reviewing countless traffic cameras and aggressively questioning local authorities, while international leaders nervously whispered about potential kidnappings and catastrophic political assassinations. The diplomatic clock was ticking violently, generating an immense, suffocating pressure that threatened to spark a massive international incident between the global organization and the highly aggressive local law enforcement agencies of the United States. The tension in the luxurious marble halls reached an absolutely unbearable, explosive peak. Inside the freezing, profoundly depressing cell, completely unaware of the massive, chaotic global search party desperately hunting for her, Aminata remained perfectly still, her sharp mind working with lethal, terrifying precision. She mentally prepared her devastating legal strategy, carefully organizing the precise, undeniable violations of the Vienna Convention she would violently hurl at her arrogant captors the very second she was finally questioned. She gently stroked Kofi's soft hair as he slept fitfully against her ruined suit, drawing immense, unyielding strength from the steady, rhythmic beating of his tiny, innocent heart against her own chest. Every single passing minute in that humiliating, degrading darkness only served to sharpen her profound, righteous fury, transforming her deep historical pain into a brilliantly focused, unstoppable weapon of pure, unadulterated justice. She was a silent, incredibly dangerous storm patiently waiting to be unleashed. The heavy, intimidating metal door of the crowded holding cell suddenly clicked loudly, the harsh, grating sound of the unlocking mechanism violently echoing through the agonizingly tense, silent space. The bright, blinding light from the hallway brutally pierced the gloomy darkness, harshly illuminating Aminata's exhausted but fiercely determined face as the arrogant lead ICE agent stepped aggressively into the doorway. "All right, you delusional lady. It is time for your interrogation," he sneered with absolute, dripping contempt, completely misinterpreting her eerie, majestic calmness for the defeated resignation of a broken, undocumented immigrant. Aminata slowly, deliberately untangled herself from the sleeping child, her posture instantly transforming from a profoundly gentle, nurturing protector to a terrifyingly regal, untouchable global diplomat preparing for absolute, devastating war. She stood up gracefully, brushing the filth from her clothes, incredibly ready to shatter his entire pathetic world. The heavy glass doors of the detention center swung open, revealing a blinding sea of flashing camera lights and shouting journalists eagerly documenting the unprecedented historic scandal. Aminata emerged into the freezing New York night, no longer an isolated, untouchable diplomat, but a fiercely protective guardian tightly holding the hands of little Kofi and his exhausted grandmother. Surrounded by a massive, heavily armed police escort aggressively clearing a safe path through the chaotic, screaming media frenzy, she projected an aura of absolute, unbreakable resolve. The massive, globally broadcasted outrage completely forced the immediate, humiliating dismissal of the racist ICE agent, violently dismantling his career while sparking a massive, radical overhaul of aggressive immigration enforcement policies across the entire city. The terrifying nightmare of an unjust, brutal deportation was officially, permanently over, completely replaced by a miraculous, fiercely protected new beginning for the traumatized, innocent immigrant family. Aminata personally, aggressively sponsored the vulnerable family's legal asylum application, utilizing her massive, unparalleled international influence to permanently secure their absolute safety on American soil. More importantly, the profound, traumatic experience completely shattered her sterile bureaucratic approach to global diplomacy, drastically fundamentally changing how she operated within the majestic United Nations. Instead of attending exclusive, luxurious gala dinners with out-of-touch billionaires, she founded an incredibly robust emergency legal clinic directly on the unforgiving streets, actively deploying pro bono international diplomats to aggressively defend marginalized immigrants on site. Her once desperately lonely, completely silent Manhattan penthouse rapidly transformed into a vibrant, incredibly warm temporary sanctuary for terrified newcomers, constantly filled with joyous, rhythmic music, delicious traditional food, and the beautiful, chaotic noise of genuine, bleeding human life. She had finally traded her incredibly vast, empty power for a profoundly meaningful, deeply connected existence. 12 years later, the majestic, impeccably polished hall of the United Nations General Assembly buzzed with intense, palpable anticipation as global leaders eagerly awaited the next speaker. Aminata, now proudly sporting elegant silver-gray hair and a profoundly serene, deeply fulfilled smile, gracefully yielded the prestigious floor to the absolute brightest, most compassionate new mediator the international organization had ever seen. A confident, incredibly eloquent young diplomat named Kofi approached the global podium, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that sharply contrasted with the faded, heavily taped bilingual dictionary permanently framed beside his microphone. He began his deeply moving, globally broadcasted speech by looking directly at his beloved mentor, his voice carrying the immense, undeniable weight of lived human experience. True diplomacy is absolutely not speaking the language of power in marble halls, but being the relentless, uncompromising voice for those the world tries to silence. The incredibly powerful, echoing resonance of Kofi's perfectly articulated words brought the entire, heavily guarded assembly room to a profound, deeply emotional standing ovation that practically shook the foundation. His incredible, triumphant journey from a terrified, shivering child clutching a battered dictionary on the freezing streets to a globally respected, fiercely compassionate international leader proved that true empathy can permanently alter destinies. Have they made any gesture of kindness that profoundly changed a fragile life? Leave a little heart right down below in the comments if you truly believe that pure, unconditional love is fundamentally more powerful than any accumulated material wealth. Subscribe to our channel right now for more incredibly touching, deeply realistic second-chance stories just like this one. Please comment, "Love is priceless," if you also believe in the absolute, undeniable power of genuine human union.